I built a fortress with the express purpose of farming dragons. This is no straightforward activity in Dwarf Fortress, because dragons are exceptionally rare, and only a handful exist in every single world that you generate. And the hardest task of all is figuring out where they are. But I'm here to show you how. So in order to accomplish this, we're going to need to play some adventure mode. You could also cheat by running this command in dfhack with the fortress loaded, but I like to do this the real way. So let's start a new character, and click through all of the character generation as quickly as possible. Then I'm going to run around on the surface of the world, in as many public spaces as possible. You see this text at the top of the screen? These are overheard conversations. They contain rumors. Rumors are knowledge that the player gains in future playthroughs, including when you embark in fortress mode. One of the things these rumors expose are lairs in the overworld. When I check my map, it shows me everything that my character is aware of, including the locations of dragon lairs. Once I'd heard rumors of the locations of several dragons, I retired the adventurer, and I started a fortress in the same world, and settled on one of the caves, inhabited by a dragon. And that's where our story begins, with the Fortress of Dragontrap. The faction that I am playing is effectively dead. It has a very small population. Its king is a refugee, meaning we're going to be fighting an uphill battle for the entirety of this playthrough. But these dwarves have bigger problems, because they're about to land on a fire-breathing powder keg, hence the name Dragontrap. My 7 unremarkable dwarves were given pretty basic skills. I knew I needed a bunch of miners, and of course I needed a mechanic for making mechanisms for traps. For items, I brought nothing but the basics. With one exception, I brought 10 cage traps. These I intended to use to catch the dragon. And with the name of the silly fortress set, items selected and the dwarves prepared, I clicked the embark button. And honestly, I was feeling pretty confident that I'd catch this dragon. It was a little bit closer to the wagon than I had initially expected, and knowing that it could kill all of my 7 dwarves with just one single sneeze, I dug underground. And we began channeling out a space for me to move all of my items, so that I could seal off access to the surface and catch that damn dragon. The whole process was rather smooth and quick, and time was of the essence, so I began constructing mechanics workshops. These I will use to create mechanisms, so I can turn those cages that I brought with me into traps. Then I instructed the dwarves to dig a little tunnel underneath where the dragon was standing, and filled it up with traps. Once the traps had been constructed and loaded, I told the dwarves to channel up to where the dragon was standing, hoping that it would be tempted by the tasty friable dwarves with a side of yak bacon, which I'd also stashed underneath where the dragon had been standing, and fall into one of my traps. But the dragon seemed to have smelled out my scheme, and refused to enter the tunnels. In fact, it had much more interest in simply torching the yaks when they popped their heads up, instead of actually walking down and into my traps. So I figured I would make some more entrances and hope that would tempt it. But no goose. The silly dragon was outsmarting me. In fact, I'd already lost 2 dwarves. We were down to 5 from the starting 7. As a Hail Mary, I told the dwarves to channel up in a few more spots, and they were smart enough to run above ground right in front of the dragon, immediately being vaporized. Good job, Jurist. At this point, the dragon had gained a taste for dwarven blood, and swiftly rampaged throughout the wagon, burning the remainder of the dwarves. So, as the good YouTuber that I am, I decided to cheat, and quit without saving, and try the whole thing again. After selecting the faction once more, I selected the same little cave in the top corner of the map, replicated the starting items, and pressed embark. The dragon was even closer this time, and this attempt somehow went worse. The dragon out here is just making a campfire and roasting marshmallows, except they're dwarf-shaped, and I'm sitting here tearing my hair out. Well, best try again. We need some more dwarves for the meat grinder. I went through the same process, rebuilt the embark, and this time I saved at the beginning, so I could just reload, like a normal cheater, instead of having to waste 15 minutes every time rebuilding the same loadout. In addition, I placed the starting location in a slightly different spot, hoping that the dragon would be a little bit further away this time. Much to my dismay, it wasn't, but the process remained the same. Dig underground, instruct the dwarves to dig a tunnel, pretend that Yeti isn't there, construct the traps, and then channel up to find the dragon. This time, the dragon immediately torched the first dwarf it saw, as is tradition, and then proceeded to torch the second dwarf that it saw, as is tradition. But as it went to kill the third dwarf, it ran down my ramps and got caught in one of my cage traps. And somehow, don't ask me how, this dwarf survived long enough to be able to witness the dragon caught, knowing that she had succeeded, as she burned to a crisp. Rest in peace, Shorast. The remainder of the dwarves had a simple task. They had to train the dragon. And you might be wondering, why am I going through this whole process of training the dragon, and talking about this fortress like it's not going to last very long? Well, you see, this here is one of 2 dragons I'm going to need for this project. The other one lies just slightly to the west on the overworld. Dragons travel within a reasonable proximity of their starting location, being their lair. And these 2 dragon lairs happen to be quite close together. Once I've captured the first dragon and trained it, I'm going to abandon Dragontrap, and then found a new fortress, with a new name and a new set of starting dwarves. So when this dragon that I've caught decides to attack me, it will already be trained. So now we get to repeat this process again, in a new location, because the dragon's training is complete. It won't be hostile when it arrives. And thus, the cycle continues. Let's torch some more dwarves. Not far to the west of Dragon Trap lies another cave. This one has a male dragon in it, unlike the previous fortress of Dragon Trap, which contained a female dragon. Meaning if we can successfully catch a second dragon, we'll have a breeding pair. At least, whenever that first dragon decides to attack us. But more on that later. For now, the hope is to complete this task without having to restart a bunch of times. Because I do intend to keep this fortress running, unlike the last one, I go with a much more standard embark. Our 7 dwarves have relatively balanced skills. The one thing outside of the norm for me is I included an animal trainer. So once we presumably catch the dragon, and of course, assuming these dwarves are still intact and not piles of burning detritus, we'll be able to train that dragon at a higher speed than we would otherwise. For items, I keep things pretty standard, except I bring a bunch of musical instruments with me, because I have no intention of bringing animals, and I thought the musical instruments would help us lull the dragon to sleep. Or, at the very least, amuse myself when I do decide to build a tavern. Aside from that, I'm bringing a couple boulders to make mechanisms, as well as a couple cages to make into traps. Very similar to the previous fortress, but less heavy on the trap materials. Lastly, I named this fortress Monsters Mash, because it is the mash, the monster mash. As you can see, a theme in this fortress is beginning to form. I'm hoping to have a variety of different large creatures that we can breed, alongside of the dragons, because I'm assuming we're going to have quite the collection by the end of the fortress. But right now, we have to focus on the task at hand, catching this nuclear firecracker. Unrelated, but look at this guy. We got ourselves a gremlin. If it's enthusiastic about levers, maybe we can catch that as well. No! I'm not gonna get my hopes up though. Anyways, better save before the dragon starts making s'mores. The dragon was happily positioned at the entrance of its cave, so I figured I would block it in. I told the dwarves to make a stonecutter shop to make some blocks, because they're lighter than boulders, and we'd have a higher chance of completing the wall at the entrance of the cave. Alongside of this dragon, there appears to be some eagle people on the map. Well, that's cool. And the dragon seems to be very unhappy about staying inside of its cave. This is probably going to be difficult. But look at that, it moved back up to where I want it. Let's see if we can place that wall. I gave the order to the dwarves to go grab it. I hope that the dragon isn't too hungry at the minute. And good old Thob, the animal trainer, runs up to the entrance of the tunnel, and Madam Dragon blows him a kiss. Hotter than the sun. Whether intentional or not, Thob is now a smoldering mass, along the lines of Calcifer. Rather than wasting my time, I decided to just simply reset, and give it another go. For my second time round, we tried a bit of a different strategy. Instead of going with the stoneworker's shop, I had them build a mechanic's shop off the bat. I figured instead of doing a direct front-end home renovation for the dragon's cave entrance, I would begin chiseling away at the base of it, and try and tempt her down to where the dwarves are working, instead of the dwarves going straight into her front door. It seems that the dwarves require a bit of a fire escape in order for this to be successful, so I had them build 2 cage traps in front of the entrance, which they completed quite swiftly. Then I swapped over to the mining tool and had them remove her exits, so that her routes in and out of the cave would be minimized. Some of the dwarves even managed to get within sneezing distance, and miraculously, everyone made it out unsinged. The dragon was still very fidgety though, and still had a few ways up onto the higher levels. This needed to be fixed swiftly. But because she was a little bit further away from where the dwarves would be running, I took the opportunity to add additional traps to the front entrance of the cave. Once I started to figure out her habits of where she liked to patrol, things got a lot more straightforward. I did attempt to build a ceiling hole so that she couldn't go up and out the entrance, and this miner here was just a mere beard length away from losing his face and being melted to a crisp. While dragons may love a dwarf flambe, the dwarves don't super appreciate it, and luckily he was able to make a swift escape from the only thing hotter than a Bitcoin miner, even though he clearly was hot enough to lose almost all of the blood in his body and a large majority of his fat. Nothing short of a goddamn miracle. While the dragon was distracted, I instructed other dwarves to continue their constructions and working on the existing ramps, removing even more of the dragon's exits. And then I slowly began adding in walls, so that if the dragon did decide to run out, it had no way of jumping out, it would just have to leave through my cage trap, all the while adding more additional traps. I was also careful to make sure that the majority of constructions weren't in open areas, and instead going through diagonals, because as you can see here, the dragon went to go torch our dwarf, but all of the fire was caught in the corner, and then when the dragon went to go fire another blast out the front, it was swiftly caught in one of my cage traps. Flawless. Time to begin constructing the fortress as we await the arrival of our second dragon. At least after we're done deconstructing all of these traps and finding a place of honor for our new imprisoned dragon. We've got a lot of unloading to do, and a lot of exploratory digging to complete. These caves, you see, go all the way down to the cavern layer, meaning I want to block them off as swiftly as possible to minimize the number of troglodytes that could come crawling out, and also expose as much of the metal as possible. As you can see, we have lignite, which is coal, as well as plenty of iron, and dolomite, which is a flux, used for making steel. Once we discover the cavern entrance, we place the seal and begin constructing our new fortress. With the dragon's seal complete, our next task was to make sure the dragon was nice and cozy. And while the dwarves carry the several hundred-year-old dragon, which is also incredibly heavy, down into the caves, I've got a few things I would like to bring up. First is the size of dragons, and how long they take to age, and second is how I'm actually going to make sure that the other dragon shows up. Underneath dragon size on the DF Wiki, you can see that at birth they're roughly the size of a fox. When they're 2 years old, they're already the size of a water buffalo. By 10, they're the size of an elephant, and it's only bigger from there. But it does take 1,000 years for a dragon to get to full size, meaning it's incredibly rare to actually find one that is fully grown, making them the second largest creature found on land in Dwarf Fortress. As a side note, there are some updates coming to the game in the next couple of months, which intend to help remedy this, making full-size dragons a possibility without doing some drastic modding or changes to world generation. The 2 dragons that we've seen in this video so far are about 1/3 of their possible size, but they are still giant and more than sufficient for combat. And now that the caged-up beauty of a dragon is now placed in her home, I'm going to talk about how we're actually going to acquire this second dragon. Dwarf Fortress includes difficulty modifiers. These can be adjusted at an extremely granular level, and one of those settings is how we're going to acquire the second dragon. Mega Beast attack period, and then in brackets it says seasons. By default this is set to 10. I'm going to change that number to 1, meaning every single season there is a chance a Mega Beast could attack. Unfortunately, that doesn't necessarily mean the dragon will appear right away, because Mega Beasts are quite a wide variety of different creatures, including giants, minotaurs, hydras, titans, forgotten beasts, and more. And as an added bonus, I'm going to make sure that once we do dig into the cavern layers, it will be open to some sort of combat. The issue here is the game will prioritize Mega Beasts over sieges, even if sieges are quote-unquote available to attack us. So the majority of the fights that we're going to have in this fortress are probably going to be against nature. But that's okay, because we do have a large supply of materials, and migrants are already starting to pile into the fortress. Right off the bat, we get some farming going in the caverns, and begin preparing barrels for our very strong alcohol, which is needed for dwarven survival. The wagon is swiftly deconstructed, and we are moved permanently underground. I quickly expanded the scale of the fortress because while playing adventure mode, I learned that there was quite a few refugees in the area. Meaning, even though the faction is dead and very small, it was likely that we would get a lot of migrants. Not bad for a little fortress. At the time of recording, there was also a recent patch, which changed how long clothing takes to break down, meaning clothing lasts a lot longer in Dwarf Fortress. So I thought that I would take the opportunity to set up an advanced dye industry, using dimple cups to make midnight blue clothing, something I haven't done in a very long time. I also set up an early armorsmiths and weaponsmiths guild, so that the dwarves could teach the young ones, and the amateur ones, how to use materials better. Since we were already getting more migrants, I accelerated the process of setting up power, so that we could grind those dimple cups and make some dye. I'll go into details on how I completed that industry in a little bit, because right now we had priorities, and that was get water flowing out of the aquifer and set up a metalsmith industry. We were going to need some squads to defend us from the incoming doom of giant monsters. I figured we'd start off with some native gold ore to speed up the process of completing these guild halls. There were a couple rodent men down in the caverns, but thankfully they were only armed with spears. And while my dwarves were mostly armed with their fists, I'd already pumped out a suit of armor or two. And the dwarves overpowered the little rodents due to their minute stature. Short kings or not, they were rather feeble. Something die, Skaven. And we even got some free spears out of it. But unfortunately, they were able to kill one of my dwarves, which was, oddly enough, how we discovered them in the first place. So I had to set up my first coffin. It's unfortunate. With the population steadily growing, I completed my first squad, and had them mostly armored in relatively consistent gear, almost entirely steel, and began renovating the entrance to the cave to look a bit more dwarfy. Some seasons had passed and humans had arrived to trade, so we happily obliged. And the population was scaling up quickly, meaning we would need more bedrooms, and I can finally get into detail about the dyeing industry. First things first, I built a dyer's shop and a loom. The dyer's shop requires a barrel to complete. The loom automatically weaves spider silk into thread, something we had access to thanks to the caves. I also set up 2 stockpiles for thread and for cloth, specifying undyed thread and only dyed cloth, as well as a third for leather, which can also be dyed. I I was also today years old when I learned that you could attach mills, which require a millstone and a mechanism, directly to water wheels, negating the need for a mechanism entirely. Pretty cool, huh? I then set up 2 jobs, one for making a bunch of leather bags, and then one for milling dimple cups. You're gonna have to click the little magnifying glass to specify dimple cups, and you'll need the bags so that the dwarves fill the bags up with dimple dye. Once the dimples have been turned into dimple dye, they can then be used to dye the thread, or the cloth or leather, at the dyer's shop. After that, we can reuse the bags. I also added an extra stockpile specifically for dimple cups, and removed them from my food stockpiles. I also decided to specify the dye thread option instead of cloth, and Drekken here was becoming an aspiring dye miller. The whole thing set up a pretty simple cycle. Webs were being automatically collected from the cavern layers and spun into thread. The dwarves would then take that thread and dye it at the dyer's shop. After that, it was spun into cloth and then placed in the stockpile. From there, the cloth could then be changed into whatever we want, because I was able to specify only use dyed cloth. It seems a little tedious when you first start messing with it, but quickly becomes quite easy, especially if you manage to just simply have enough scale that you always have dimple cups around that can be milled into more dye, and you always have enough silk or thread of some kind that can be made into dyed thread. It becomes quite smooth. Anyways, moving on, the dwarves were creating artifacts. We just got a perfect rose quartz. Thank you, Onul. The fortress had grown quite considerably. In fact, we'd reached the Nintendo number. And as with any fortress, I felt behind on bedrooms at all times, so I kept expanding them, and the dwarves were continuing to mine so that we could build more of our needed armor to fight the inevitable threats. And we were going to need a mayor, so I began furnishing some offices, and also included a hospital nearby, which I figured I would need soon. Moments later, we elected a dwarf as mayor. Moma's the gem cutter, and it's a good thing I decided to build that hospital because we were getting attacked by giant polar bears. I know that normal ones are pretty giant, but these ones are bigger, as well as some polar bear people, which, much to chat's insistence, I decided to use DF Hack to cheat and force them to join the fortress. For one specific purpose. They wear very different sized clothing than normal dwarves, making them quite difficult to keep clothed and happy. But alongside of that clothing patch was a small tweak, making it so that when you're trading, if you have different sizes of different populations in your fortress, the traders will bring some clothing sized for a percentage of the different sized people. And I plan to test it by clothing these polar bear people with clothing from the trade caravans, presumably making every single furry in the audience cry themselves to sleep. As a spoiler, it was very effective. Every single trader brought a couple things sized for the polar bear people, which was very nice of them. And just like that, we get our first real threat in the fortress. A minotaur, Riffy Thepa Kakwi, a giant humanoid monster with the head of a bull. Good to meet ya, Madam Fugly. Either step into a cage trap or slam yourself on a spear, whichever you prefer. Turns out what she actually preferred was pummeling old Famille Noir to death. Rest in peace, you poor soul. And after splattering that dwarf's innards all over the ground, she then chose death by colliding with my squads, who'd had quite a bit of training time in at this point, and cut her to shreds. Shockingly quickly. Should've chose the cage trap, you monster. We'll catch the next one. Things kept moving at a relatively rapid pace in the fortress. The bedrooms continued to expand, and it was starting to look like a proper fortress at this point. We've skipped some time, so the population had risen all the way up to 82, and our clothing industry was quite extensive. The dwarves were loving the high value of the midnight blue dye. And in case you've forgotten, the entire point of this video is to try and catch a second dragon, and make baby dragons. But the game appears to have other plans, and instead of sending a dragon, it sends everything but dragons. And next on its bucket list was a gigantic birdie, referred to as a roc, a great bird of prey so large that it dwarfs many dragons. I see what you did there, game. All beneath its mighty wings shall fear the sky. What if we are beneath its mighty wings with sharp objects? We'll see who wins in a fair fight, bird monster. At this point, I hadn't made up my mind as to whether or not I wanted to keep it or kill it. There were some cage traps set up, and I figured that the squads would get out of the way in time and allow it to get caught. In fact, we had even more time because it kept getting distracted by the cats. I guess it wanted to defend its smaller brethren. We'll give it a nickname. Hello there, Dwayne. And as he made his way down, it quickly became apparent that my soldiers hadn't in fact gotten out of the way in time and stabbed the creature to death. Well, at least we'll have giant turkey legs. Feels better than saying rock legs. Chow down, dwarves. I'm sure there will be more of them to come. Moments later, the game decided to throw this giant naked lady giant at me, and thankfully there was a trade caravan there which stabbed her to death. And they were seemingly somehow very impressed with my fortress, even though I let them get attacked by a giant, accidentally, of course. They were so impressed, in fact, they asked if we wanted to become a barony, and become proper members of the realm. Of course I accepted, and provided the absolute honor to Paddington Bear, one of my polar bear people. Run the fortress with care, Oh great Paddington Bear. After that, trading went as normal, and the dwarves remained hopeful that a dragon would arrive. So we began building an enclosure for it, as well as other weird creatures that we decided to catch. But instead the game fired a forgotten beast at my face. So I readied the dwarves with the spears, and after a brief stabbing match, the dwarves were victorious, and the creature fell. It was promptly butchered and turned into meatballs. The food supply and variety obviously kept the morale up, and the game kept demanding more guild halls. I love this new piece of UI. It's so lovely. It even indicates the value that you have left to construct. Word was spreading quickly about the wondrous Baron Paddington, and their anticipation of acquiring a second dragon, so more migrants continued to arrive. Some of them were very large and had 2 heads and insisted they were a dragon. We did not believe them, so we stabbed them to death and honored the soldiers with nicknames. Forgotten Beasts also claimed that they were dragons. We disagreed. That looked like a hairy scorpion. In protest, we turned them into pincushions. As for the dragon enclosure, it was coming along nicely, and the front door of the fortress was going to need a redesign if I was actually going to catch anything in cage traps. And these bloody giants, please put a shirt on, kept coming in full force. There was whole families of them. Thankfully, the soft tissue of their upper torso was completely uncovered, thus making excellent stabbing practice. Time was passing quickly, and I was turning my fortress into a fashion fortress. Between the blue clothing and the royal value of the tavern and entry halls was becoming obvious. It required opulence to tempt a dragon. But instead, what do we get? Another rock! And as always, the rock was legendary, holding many hundreds of kills. And as it flew towards the fortress, I ordered the soldiers drop their weapons and scamper down into the caves, for we had traps prepared this time. And as it made its way into the entrance, I hoped everything was clear. But unfortunately, the rock was able to catch out several creatures who were none the wiser. The first being Urosh, the polar bear woman, who was one of my soldiers. She was returning from a siege, a diplomatic stabbing session as we call it. While we were victorious in that battle, we were not victorious against the great bird. Moments later, she fell, and as the beast entered our halls, I hoped it would enter the cage traps, but instead it was distracted by Urist the moron. It was at this moment that I understood the creature's anger towards us. We had killed his child. Not only that, his firstborn son, Dwayne Beanpack the Rock Johnson. The Great Nighthaled's fury was let out on Urist the Stupid, and frankly, we deserve it. But the creature's fury was swift, slaughtering 3, before being tempted by the soft bodies down below and falling directly into one of our traps. I suppose his vengeance on us has been taken, and we shall have our vengeance in the form of chaining him up to create more rocks. I guess it's time for us to make this thing a little bit more secure. It's been an average of 2 attacks per season, and they aren't going to slow down anytime soon. In fact, I'm going to need to expand the hospital and build a doctor's guild to minimize future damage on the dwarves. The corpse pile outside was getting a little large, alarmingly so, but overall morale in the fortress was still grand, and the population had grown considerably. Losses were acceptable if it meant that we could capture the creature of our dreams. A breeding pair of dragons. In the later months, we caught a minotaur, hoping to see what a minotaur calf would look like if we were to catch additional minotaurs. And as the planters expanded and demanded guilds, we clearly disturbed some rocks in our fertile soil. But this time, we were prepared, except for the High Master Hammer Dwarf Meng, who was sound asleep and couldn't hear the alarms. This will be the longest rest of your life, sweet dwarf. The bird, seemingly satisfied with the damage that she'd done, she made her way into the fortress, and once again fell into our traps, only to be placed next to the Minotaur, alongside of her new mate. Hopefully there will be many Dwaynes in the Male Rocks Johnson. Alright, I can't keep this bit up anymore. Let's move on. So I'm just going to sit here and hope for a dragon. That's not a dragon, game! Not even close. It could have just stayed forgotten. Why do you have to make this so complicated? One of my dwarves was so enthusiastic about the fighting it brought a cup into battle, and they shredded it rather quickly. Disgusting. The game won't let me rest for a single second. Now it's time to deal with an Etten. Where's the goddamn dragon? It's right next to us on the map. What's going on, dragon? Is your Uber late or something? For full clarity here, it has been almost 7 years of in-game time, and that's no small amount of gameplay. Thankfully, the Etten just ran directly into one of my traps. I didn't even need to turn a burrow on. At least it's well behaved. But we do have some good news after the repeated assaults of things that are not dragons. And that is, we have baby rocks. Not only that, but they are laying multiple sets of eggs. And their babies look like hairless chickens. Chickens have hair, right? I presume so. Anyways, while not all of the eggs that they lay are fertile, the majority seem to be, and we already have 2 young. They lay a batch of eggs once a season, and the extras are turned into either decorations or cooked for food. I give them some additional nest boxes for when the little ones grow up in a couple of years. I guess if I keep working on the dragon's new home, eventually it'll arrive. One can only hope, because our collection has grown considerably. We now have 2 minotaurs, adult and baby rocks, and the aforementioned Etten. We'd also placed our singular dragon in the dragon's home, or its future home. It will live inside of this cage until its mate arrives. And I don't mean that in the Australian mate. And my god, I shouldn't need to say this anymore. That's a cyclops, not a dragon. I tried to catch this one as well. I thought I'd chuck it in with the collection, but one of my dwarves managed to hack it to death, which is quite impressive actually, considering they had no combat skills and used a pickaxe. Good job, Piglet. You're gonna go down in the annals of history, having killed one of the many minotaurs and cyclopses and ettins that has arrived in this fortress. One day, we will have another dragon, I swear. At least we have a whole lot of rocks. See? More funny chicken things. And a fortress that's looking like a fortress. It's very lively. Almost 250 population. Everybody's happy, except for that guy. I was in the process of completely satisfying our Baron's needs by creating a grand tomb for old Paddington Baron. Get it? Baron? As in polar baron? Anyways, the multi-headed Ettins portion of the collection was beginning to expand, and I was beginning to expect that we were never going to get another dragon. In fact, after that, we got a Swamp Titan, which also, while cool, isn't a dragon. This one was a big spider-like thing, and the soldiers pretty efficiently put it down. Another year or two pass, and it has been 11 years since we embarked in this great fortress. Perhaps after this trading session with the pointy-eared elves, our dreams will come true, and we will see the great scaly Cyclops. All right, fine. Either get in a cage or die to my captain. Your choice. I guess it chose die to my captain. Thankfully, we've improved the hospital, so he'll actually recover from his wounds, unlike the many who didn't. Let's not worry about that. More forgotten beasts. This one took some dwarves down with it. As I said, let's not worry about that. The humans have begun bringing wagons because we are a barony, and the scale of our economy was practically unparalleled with anything I've done in a fortress as of late. In order to attract a dragon, you needed immense wealth. At least that's what Tolkien told me, and Shrek, and every other piece of media with a dragon in it. But this was no ordinary trading session. In fact, this was going to prove to be the most important trading session of this fortress. A trading session that I had trained for a very long career. 10 or so years, give or take. And this was a very momentous occasion. A grand occasion. One of the most important sessions of trading that this fortress would ever do. I wasn't quite prepared for what was about to happen. The hunting dragon, Olsmo Angonto Tosamu Uslot, has come, but we'll name her Trogdor, a gigantic reptilian creature. It is magical and can breathe fire. These monsters live for thousands of years. The dragon has arrived, but it is a dragon attack unlike any other. There's no need for spears or cages, just simply a brave animal trainer to go greet the stray dragon, who is semi-wild, having retained her training from the starting 7 dwarves. Because my dwarves, meaning me, immediately fell in love with the beast, we gave her a nickname, Trogdor, the Burninator, who will now occupy this circular room, right next to her future mate, and will be provided with nest boxes and a personal trainer. Once she's been pastured, she can begin laying eggs. And the first set that she laid were not fertilized. I guess she hadn't properly gotten to know her future, I'll still say future, mate. You better fertilize that next set. I'm watching you with great interest. If I need to give them examples, I can just show them the rocks. See, they're doing fine. We have multiple full-grown ones already. Anyways, time to make an omelet. In fact, they're so enthusiastic, more are arriving. But it's almost like they know exactly where the cage traps are now, and they just dive straight in. It's kind of nice. Now, where were we? Omelets. Wait, no. I mean, dragons. I guess it's time to wait 3 months until they lay another set of eggs. Until then, I have a pan heating up. But of course, first there's going to be a whole bunch of forgotten beasts. And honestly, this one's kind of adorable. I'm intentionally keeping the cavern levels open so that the forgotten beasts do have access to the fort, mostly for my own entertainment. And in this case, to help keep the livestock count down. I'm mostly keeping it open for 2 reasons. The first being it's entertaining to fight them, and the second is I really want to fight the spoilers. You'll know what I mean when we get there, which is why you need to keep this video on your second monitor and fall asleep, so I get the maximum runtime. There now. You didn't hear that. I am not in your mind, nor am I reading it. Go back to bed. so don't forget to unpause. Unlike dragons, rocks grow up extremely quickly and reach their maximum size after just 1 year, also allowing them to multiply, meaning the population is about to have an absolute explosion. The best part is, just like dragons, they can be trained for hunting and war. If I train them for hunting, they'll go around the map and kill animals for me, and can be manually assigned as pets. If I train them for war, they're also assignable as pets, and will follow my military off-map to invade enemy military positions. We're going to take full advantage of this. I also noticed something a little bit strange. Trogdor is a member of the Bolt of Toes. I'm actually not sure whose government that is, because it's not mine. Weird. But regardless, I'm just waiting for their babies to hatch. And it wouldn't take long, because just a few weeks later, I was culling the duck population and noticed 2 stray baby dragons. Oh my god, I've finally done it. I feel the need to explain how exciting this was and is for me. I have played Dwarf Fortress since 2009, and this is the first time I've witnessed a baby dragon. This is also the first time I've successfully managed to breed dragons. Somehow every other time I've gotten a pair of dragons, one of them has been gay. And back then, because they didn't have baby varieties and were considered adults at birth, they previously could not be tamed. But now they can. These baby dragons are tameable. And we're going to have a tame army of dragons, at least once the mom and dad have more babies. And of course, we wait 10 years for these babies to grow up. Time to play the waiting game. And remember, mom and dad, make more babies, fertilize those eggs, or I'm making omelets. The Forgotten Beasts tried to ruin my party. It wasn't very successful. And the dragons were listening to my instructions. Clearly, they weren't a fan of my omelet constructions. And unlike the dragons and the rocks, I was having no luck breeding the minotaurs and entons. I'd also caught some giants, but all they did was kind of get upset and get annoyed and not be pleased about their situation instead of making babies. But when I was playing at the time, I didn't realize this, so I kept them around. But eventually, I give up and use them as dragon bait. We'll get there when we get there. For right now, I'm staring at these fertile eggs. And making omelets. The fortress was really coming into its own at this point. Since we were training dragons and learning how to tame them, I decided it was time to build a library to preserve that knowledge. And more babies were hatching. Things were good. My dragon's population was now 5 young and 2 adults. The adults could never be fully tamed and would need to be retrained periodically, so we needed to keep a supply of meat. Thankfully, I had plenty of livestock to stab to pieces, and I can never understate the amount of forgotten beasts that we were butchering. I also wanted to increase the overall wealth of the fortress to properly suit the dragons that we had. I was also hoping that we would find some hydras at some point, which also require a very high level of value. I wasn't sure how many of them were left in the world, and I was hoping to get another breeding pair if I got lucky. I also had to keep digging deeper, because as I previously mentioned, I wanted to fight the spoilers, and thus we'd have to expose it. I knew where the entrance was, that mysterious wall studded with gems, several layers beneath this area that we're digging out, but we'll get to that fight when we get to it. For now, we had trading to attend to, and humans to impress. I'm sure they found my giant birds intimidating. We considered this a bargaining tactic. At this point, I had the trading depot set up in the fortress itself. I would later move this due to some accidents with the dragons. Totally not my fault, of course, but it's something I felt I'd mention because it's gonna move. Deep digging was progressing quickly. In fact, we were starting to find green diamonds, and dwarves were becoming campfires. Strange. We should probably try to avoid that, but no matter. At least there's plenty of other dwarves where they came from. This one was the first one to die to the big entrance of the spoilery fun stuff. It's a shame, really, but because you were first, you get a cool memorial. Hope you're happy. I know I am, because I get the gems, and all that lava spilling out means it's time to adjust the strategy ever so slightly. We're gonna dig above, instead of channeling directly into it, and then after we're done trading, I'm going to fill this area up with a glass floor so that we can see what's underneath it, and dig a little bit safer. After all, we do have plenty of time before those dragons grow up. The trading itself was pretty smooth, and the dwarves were very impressed with our amazing stature, and rose us up to a higher level in society. Around this point, the king himself showed up, and lauded our efforts with compliments. Thank you, king. And I do wonder if these rocks are related, because they keep arriving and trying to attack me. They should know better by now. Their friends and family keep on not coming back. Well, at least they jumped directly into the cage. That's very polite of them. I was trying to get my glassworking industry up and running, but this forgotten beast distracted me. But it's okay. One of my favorite militia dwarves, Rookie, decided to solo him. You make it look so easy, Dwarf. The other thing that the traders were impressed with was the extensive nature of our clothing industry. There was so much dyeing in the fortress, it was beginning to seem just like a standard feature. Probably just a sign of dominance. Not only that, but it must have been such an efficient sign of dominance, combine that with our wealth exporting, that my faction constructed a hillocks nearby. These are surface forts, built by peasant dwarves and merchants. They do contain people that you can request as workers, who are helpful in times of need. For the game's overall simulation, they provide food for the area. Very handy to have. And they appointed a bunch of leaders as well. They called their group the Gear of Slaughter. That's kind of badass. The dragons were kind of dragging their feet and not being anywhere near as efficient with the baby making as I wanted. Unfortunately, the ducks on the other end of the map kept claiming all of the nest boxes, so I kept on having to rebuild them, which was getting a little bit annoying considering the ducks had their own nest boxes. Share, you guys, come on. At least the dragon's home looked really cool. The Forgotten Beasts must have agreed because they really wanted to move in. This one breathed fire, which made it kind of scary, to be honest. and after running in and burning a couple wild animals, it decided to just run away. I guess it had smoke in its eyes. We were very vulnerable. It could have done a lot more damage to us. And it's a good thing it ran off too, because I was suddenly very distracted by multiple things. You see, this one-eyed bandit decided to arrive and attack us. This one also had some really cool artifacts in its inventory, and it began beelining its way towards my fortress. So I had to split my view portal between flooring off the lower levels so that we could fight the fire beast without the ground burning, while staring at this cyclops. Thankfully, it was able to get caught in a cage, and did so before the Forgotten Beast got back. While that might seem convenient, it was extremely stressful. Most of the caverns were smoldering, and I was doing my best to make some makeshift battlements so that my Marks dwarves could shoot it while it was down in the water. I was very worried that this Forgotten Beast would do a lot of damage to me, which is why I was shocked when a dwarf showed up dead. The beast hadn't done anything. How did that dwarf die? Turns out, it was bit by a helmet snake, which are rather small cavern creatures that have a very deadly paralyzing poison. A single bite from one of these snakes is instant death. There's no way around it. So, congratulations. You died to the small threat that you could have killed by kicking. At least you didn't burn to death, I suppose. Although suffocating is probably pretty bad as well. Rest in peace. Underground renovations for the Forgotten Beast fight were underway. I was digging out space so that my Marks dwarves could shoot, and continuing to put flooring pieces down. I was also scheming something. I wanted to see just how effective my dragons would be against mega beasts as well as other creatures, so I was preparing some tests in the background. But eventually the Forgotten Beast got it into its head that it would be a good idea to attack us. We should rename this thing the Forgetful Beast. But it actually outsmarted me. It came in the side entrance that I didn't know existed, and began setting the grass on fire exactly as I hoped wouldn't happen. Not only did it kill a bunch of my livestock and cause a bunch of burning, it also ambushed me while I was still doing the constructing side of things. It was a bit of a massacre. We lost most of our farming, and the creature filled up my exits with smoke, blocking their access from the dwarves. In a panic, I suspended as many jobs as I possibly could to try to get the dwarves to leave if they weren't there already. But thankfully, some of my dwarves were listening, mostly the Marks dwarves, who were filling it up with steel bolts. Several of the bolts had pierced the creature's lungs and it could no longer breathe, meaning it was just a matter of time before it would suffocate. But even though it was severely injured, it wasn't going down without a fight and continued to thrash and cause the dwarves to burn, until it inevitably collapsed. But the losses were pretty intense, so we only had one option: begin making gravestones, or be overrun with ghosts. I had to renovate the gardens down below. Of course, we had backup farms, but these were the majority of my food output, and I wasn't ready to let them go. Things went back to normal for a bit in Monster Smash, at least as normal as they could be. However, the decor was becoming more and more coffin-oriented, and even though the fight ended quite some time ago with that flaming beast, fires were still smoldering. You could hear the crashes of the burning trees crumbling down in the depths. Thankfully, things more or less returned to normal, aside from the occasional crashing tree down below, and the dragons were continuing to create more young and fertilize eggs. But I wanted to see just how effective they were at killing those megabeasts, as previously mentioned. So I had put an Etten in a cage connected to a lever inside of their enclosure, and then had a dwarf give that lever a pull to release the Etten. Now, you might think the game is paused, but it's not. The Etten is simply petrified and wallowing in misery. You see, she's been in prison for a while, so we'll just give her a second to get her wits about her. Once she pops into being and realizes that she's been freed, she stands up, is relieved after being released from confinement, and is immediately turned into blue fire. Not only that, one of my dragon hatchlings bites it in the right head, which tears the left cheek in their right head. The same dragon hatchling then claws it, and it would only take a few seconds and another blast of fire for the Etten to be gone entirely. We're going to have to set up a defensive system with these things, at least just for beasts and monsters. I don't know how they'd fare against an army though, because they're kind of glass cannons. Maybe not right now, but for sure when they get a little bit bigger. I'm also getting the feeling that I should turn some of my rocks into war rocks, because almost none of their eggs are fertilized anymore. I don't think it has anything to do with all of the sulfur in the air from the lava either. Somehow, with all the chaos, the elves aren't horribly pissed off at me. You see, they don't like it when you chop down trees. I guess they don't consider burning down trees to be chopping them down, because it does generally leave the trunk intact. Fascinating. I guess I'll take the giant animals that they bring for trading, when they bring them. You'll probably see those giant bears occasionally. That's theirs. No, that's not a giant bear. That's a forgotten beast. And another one that decided to attack my fortress. You see, if it had more than one brain cell, it would have realized that was a bad idea. But it didn't realize that was a bad idea, so we cut it to pieces. My strategy of building glass on the upper floors to dig too deep was paying off. You see, I was finding these strange holes, pockets of air almost, inside of the mysterious wall studded with gems. Whenever I would spot those, I would dig around them on the layer below, and then smooth those areas up, and then chisel holes in the sides. This would expose whatever was on the inside, which in some cases was cool items, gifts from the gods, if you will, and in other cases were horrible murder monsters that wanted to rip my face off. Thankfully, they were stuck behind a very thick fortification and sitting ducks. I would then take their items, if they had any, and melt them down, which went into the pile with all my other bars. Also of note, we got attacked by Jagna, who was a were-iguana, from a fortress that I played in this world about 50 years ago in-game. Kind of wild when that happens. It's unfortunate that he chose this fortress, though, because yes, he was able to do some damage to my dwarves. The only dwarf he bit, he killed. That was Nomald. Sorry, dude. And shortly after, my soldiers arrived and killed the iguana rather swiftly. It was a short battle, a rather anticlimactic one even. Goodbye, poor dwarf. I hope your life in the world sim was a pleasant one. I threw him into the egg scrambler and moved on with my life, which consisted of waiting a lot of time and trading and invading the goblins, because I'd finally trained my rocks to be used in the military, and they were very good at it. We also gave them appropriate combat names, such as Dwayne, Rocky, Pebble, and Purple Dwayne. Very original, I know. The population of giant rocks that I had in the fortress was getting so intense that I was butchering them as a source of food, as well as training and producing many more. They'd officially become the world's largest chickens. But you know what I don't have in the fortress yet? Hydras. Ted has arrived, a giant dragon-like monster with 7 biting heads. Unlike rocks and dragons, these give birth to full-grown young, which is a positive and also a negative. It's positive because they breed and multiply extremely quickly. It's a negative because they can't be trained for war. But they're still aggressive and will attack things if put in a situation where they feel threatened. And just like the rocks and Ettins and giants, it walked directly into my trap. Thank you, beast. And this could have been avoided. I wasn't paying attention, clearly. Something evil is emerging from the newly exposed pocket. This one was just plain funny. It was a spider made of steam, which was unceremoniously killed by Awaklost, who hit it with a pick, causing it to explode. Good shot, dwarf. And let's not forget the Forgotten Beasts, which were still an active, going concern. My military was so large, I had plenty to spare. Some were hanging around the caverns, some were hanging around the surface, and the rest were simply invading the goblins. The goblins were quite threatening, but they were no match for my incredible forces, rocks, and soon-to-be armies of dragons. They worked like a treadmill. They'd come back from a siege, and I'd immediately put them on another task and send them back out. I was getting pretty efficient at this. Efficient enough that by the time the goblins did start invading me, they barely even had any armies. It was actually kind of sad. Their soldiers were armed, but with very weak weapons, and almost none of them had armor. While they were always able to take out a handful of my dwarves, it was kind of a non-fight, and we would inevitably steamroll them. So I decided it was about time to build a more effective front door, fill it up with dragons, and actually use the creatures that we'd acquired as some form of defense. Especially considering most of the time my military wasn't even entirely on the map, and my dwarves were too busy digging deeply and greedily to join the military. And it's a shame that no matter how skilled a dwarf is with their pickaxe, they're still susceptible to burning. Awaklost lost their life in the caves that day. A damn shame. But at least you didn't die to a goblin. You died with honor. I let a whole year pass behind the scenes while we continued to invade the goblins, because we've just completed our front door, and this Cyclops thinks it's a very good idea to invade us. They must not have much depth in their vision, because this is clearly a terrible idea, especially right now. As the creature wanders into our freshly paved new front gate and crosses over the threshold through the door, they are greeted by curly, adorable, reptilian thermite. And it was very effective. Similarly effective was our efforts digging deeply and greedily over the past year, as we'd reached adamantine, raw adamantine, and we were getting close to the point where we just need to build a throne to become the mountain home. But the Cyclopses kept attacking, and the demons kept coming through cracks in the walls, and the dragons kept burning, and the dwarves kept smelting, and the king is pleased, forging spears out of mythical metal. But I was about to have to make a hard decision. It might be time to get rid of some of my pets. You see, the rocks were too great in number to maintain training on all of them, and some of them reverted back to being wild, and executed the entirety of my bird population. The ironic thing is I named this one Freebird. I had to send in the military to put down the creature. Thankfully, if they've been trained and were pastured, they remain pastured when they become wild again. They just simply attack everything that enters. Poor thing. It didn't really know what it was doing after all. At this point, hubris and casualties aside, I didn't care. I just wanted to keep digging. And the dragons kept burning, and the sieges were getting a bit more intense. I had to back up the baby dragons, as they were quite fragile during sieges. It is worth noting that while they do breathe fire on mega beasts and monsters, they don't breathe fire on enemy sieges. My theory behind this is that because there's a siege happening, the game assumes that there's soldiers in the mix. So once they've been tamed, they aren't going to obliterate your military during a siege, which is good and bad. It would be good to have giant flamethrowers, but it's also nice to have your dwarves fighting alongside of the dragons, which I took full advantage of. And it was that time of year again. Time to trade once more. Trading went by without a hitch, and thankfully was over and done with by the time the next Cyclops arrived, which I was kind of gambling with, to be honest, because it wouldn't be too difficult for them to miss slightly and... sorry, Toasted Shambo. I didn't want you to have to live up to your name. Where was I? Right. It wouldn't be too hard for the dragons to accidentally sneeze a little further than they intended and burn the trading depot. But that's a risk I'm willing to accept for the minute, because we'd acquired something that I had been waiting a very long time for, a female Hydra. I quickly locked the doors so that it would get caught in one of my traps, and it was very effective, because soon after, we had a trained Hydra, which we locked up near its new mate. Have fun, kids. Make some babies, please. And Hydras have a habit of making twins and triplets a lot. Worst case, they'll work as a very efficient source of meat. Best case, I'll figure out some way to use them in combat. Perhaps I'll use them to fight the endless onslaughts of forgotten beasts, or alternatively I could use the dragons for that, because for the most part, my dwarves are pretty good at taking things out, such as this titan, who was killed by a Marks dwarf. But there's just something satisfying about watching a creature run unknowingly into the baby dragons and immediately blasted with a wave of searing fire. The friendly fire is a little bit of a problem though, best not worry about it. And those goblins still seem to think it's a good idea to invade me. You'd think they would have gotten the idea by now. As the ambushes and snatchers arrived, the dragons did their best to rip them apart, as I moved the military up to assist. This was a close one, and some dragon blood was spilled. Thankfully none of them died, but there were more close calls than I would like to admit. My military arrived quick enough, and thankfully none of the baby dragons perished, but there was still more goblins patrolling the surface, and I decided to just send the soldiers to go clean up the remainder, and they did so, with brutal efficiency. As the fighting calmed down, I received a notice that my Hydras had made some children. Excellent. They're a very heady bunch. I decided to take the extras and put them into this cage, because keeping them trained was going to become difficult rather quickly, so I had to stay on top of their numbers. And as always, the Titans continued. I mean, I was sieging the goblins, but the Titans decided to attack me instead of the goblins. This one had webs, which made it quite the threat. However, we saw just how effective Dragonfire is against Silk, and we get our first glimpse at the destructive force of Dragonfire, obliterating the door, the bridge, and the trading depot entirely, as well as the Titan and all of its remains. Holy crap. Naturally, I decided I should probably build a better entrance, just somewhere that my traders could trade and be sealed off in case of creature invasion. Enough of the unnecessary risks, we were digging too deep, and I think it came out quite nicely, to be honest. Aside from sieges, I needed the front of the fortress's defense to be pretty much automated. Same with the cavern layers. So I stationed a couple baby dragons in each, and while they did let random wild animals in, like this giant ox, any monsters were turned into toast. My dwarves were too busy dealing with the creatures down below, and continuing to dig deeper. But there were some creatures that my soldiers had to fight, such as this demonic overlord from the great underworld, the lime fiend Isen Newtwood, the sepia fiend, an ancient and horrible demon which escaped from the underworld at the dawn of time. It became the master of the last evil, which is the goblin faction that we've been fighting with, and it brought the dark forces of Gear Spider, which I had been ravaging for the past several years. And once again, the army was pretty mid. The demon itself put up a good fight. The baby dragons did a good deal of damage to them, killing many of their soldiers, but it only took one dwarf, who went by the name Comet Colossus, for he had killed several bronze colossi in the past. Comet soloed the beast, toppling the leadership of the goblin military. I knew that they would be scattered, so it was time to begin conquering them properly. And so with my next siege, I instructed them to destroy sites and conquer and occupy. The soldiers that remained were mostly Marks dwarves, stationed in the deeps, waiting for creatures to emerge. And of course, the forgotten beasts. But the fights continued, until finally, a glorious moment. Lifting the curtain a little bit, a patch released, which added actual diplomacy options into Dwarf Fortress. These are attached to the messenger, which is an assignable role. I sent out a messenger and demanded the goblins surrender. And to my surprise, they did. Although I had killed literally thousands of them, so maybe that greased their desire a little bit. Having lessened the threat of the goblins, I figured it was time to properly assault the underworld. And this required some experiments. I was going to take the dozens of hydras in the cage and place it near where I assumed the entrance would be, and attached it to a lever, so I could release them all simultaneously. I also positioned a dragon near the entrance as well, because I wanted to know if they were dragon fire-proof or not. The dwarves chipped through the last of the adamantine brick walls, and horrifying screams echoed from the darkness below. The dwarves trembled, and some of them even dropped their picks, in utter shock and awe. Whines and cries from the great underworld echoed throughout the fortress, and even the dragons trembled. They knew they had discovered a great threat, but they weren't entirely sure what they were in for. the menagerie of creatures from the depths made their way towards the surface, and the dwarves retreated to the safety of the upper walls, leaving the hydras behind as their first line of defense, and orders were given to release the remainder of the beasts, and to seal the gates, and man the bolt throwers. Somehow I managed to put a hostile cave dragon into this cage. I have no recollection of doing that, but it died immediately upon emerging. And the clown car was released, and my Hydra box was also ready and waiting. Flame monsters, great beasts of fire, emerged first, and instantly caused all of the animals in the region to erupt into flames. Some of them were able to do damage. As they bled, the steam of their evaporating blood extinguished some of the flames. And thankfully, creatures of this size have immense amounts of blood. So while engulfed in flame, they were as effective as a sitting duck. Once extinguished, they could get a few hits in, and some of the demons began to fall. But, as if it was inevitable, the demons broke through and made their way to the upper levels. But I had instructed my dwarves to fire at will, an order which they obliged, graciously. As the second and third orders to reload had been given, the caverns went silent for a moment. Was this victory? Had the dwarves succeeded? The silence passed swiftly, and more creatures began to emerge, and met with the few remaining hydras that I had positioned as defense, and actually reached the dragon this time. It was at this point that I learned that most of them are, in fact, immune to dragon fire. A damn shame. More creatures emerged, which we later began to call eyeless demons, great towering birds with deadly dust. And the dwarves continued to act as a firing squad, for as long as our ammo supplies would last. I should have just presumed that the demons wouldn't be affected by dragon fire. I didn't check the wiki. I was being hopeful. Obviously, these blobs made of fire wouldn't be affected, but I had some hope for the fleshy ones. Oh well. At least the bolt throwers are earning their pay. The biggest threats were the eyeless demons, the bird guys with the dust. The fire creatures exploded after getting hit by a singular bolt, and the quantity over precision of the bolt throwers, while effective, simply helped the Marks dwarves land the killing blows on many of them. And I guess all the commotion made this one Minotaur decide now would be a good time to attack. He was not correct. And the fighting continued for quite some time. But eventually, the noise went silent as the final beasts fell. The deadly dust that the eyeless demons project causes projectile vomiting, which doesn't affect the accuracy of my bolt throwers, but does upset the dwarves quite greatly. Since their numbers had dropped, it was time to begin the head-on assault, and I positioned my soldiers near the entrance of the underworld, and the dwarves entered, wading through the viscera and corpses. Lamox led the attack, followed by my many dozens of legendary soldiers, each with hundreds of kills to their name. All we had to do was seal off the underworld and remove the hole that my miners had created so that we could chisel away the rest of the adamantine that lined the tunnel. Dwarves had began dying of their injuries, a few infections. The hospital wasn't even that far away from the entrance, but casualties were inevitable. More eyeless demons emerged, and the soldiers challenged them head-on, vomit and gore being flung left and right. But the dwarves stood firm, and the beasts fell. They moved down towards the entrance. As more devils emerged, the ashen insects were fragile, but if a dwarf got hit, they flew to pieces. The numbers of casualties began to increase. Some even tumbled down into the underworld, but many would live to tell the tale. As the final brick was put into place, all became still. It was time to clean up the grim tunnels, memorialize the dead, and collect the remainder of the riches, and prepare for the next assault. And also fight some forgotten beasts, I guess. Some things never end, or change. My military was battered, but still mostly intact. This beast had webs. In order for us to be successful against it, my soldiers would have to get to the caverns before it did. But unfortunately, I was too late. By the time the soldiers had reached the creature, it was already in the stairwells. The losses were too great to fully comprehend. Our mayor was ripped to shreds, and for a moment, I thought the fortress would fall, until they were able to surround the beast and knock it unconscious for a brief moment, and the dwarves pummeled it to death. This wasn't the first nor the greatest threat to the fortress's safety, but it required desperate measures. I informed the local hillocks that we needed workers, and sent my messenger to complete the request. And before they arrived, we'd already prepared hundreds of additional coffins, which we would surely need in due time. Because it wouldn't take long before all of the adamantine that remained had been cut down and mined. We would soon go deeper and challenge the ancient evils buried within the gems. No threat was too great for Monsters Mash. The majority of the infant dragons had finally reached adulthood and were continuing to valiantly defend the fortress, and they continued laying eggs. The humans from nearby wanted to know what the commotion was and brought their wagons in for cautious trading. They'd felt the earthquakes from miles away, but we assured them that everything was well and trading went as normal. Because unknown to the humans, they were standing upon a great danger. The dwarves had chiseled back into hell to mine additional adamantine. They had positioned Mark's dwarves a layer above, ready and waiting to shoot anything that comes through those gaps. With a crack opened in the adamantine walls, I gave the orders to place more bricks on the entrance to hell. And for a moment, everything remained quiet. But it wouldn't take long for the creatures to begin their journey towards the fortress once more. And an explosion of dust leapt from those walls, and dwarves began to ricochet around with the force, colliding with walls and dying on the impact. But the dwarves had numbers to their advantage now, and the beasts fell as soon as they emerged. We were going to block that entrance, if it was the last thing the dwarves do. Many of the dwarves were braver than they had any right to be, climbing down into hell itself to fend off the demons as they came up towards the unsuspecting miners, valiantly flinging themselves down to the slayed floor. The dense gravity down below killed them as they landed, and the ones that were unlucky enough to survive were killed by ricocheting debris. The beasts continued to enter the tunnel, but the soldiers held the line, and some Cyclops thought it was a good idea to attack. I didn't even look at it. I'm sure the dragons got this. Perhaps I was overzealous. Perhaps this was a mistake, but the dwarves held the line. Rookie was losing blood and was going to fall. Dumat was nauseous, faint, and bleeding heavily. Knees are weak. Mom's spaghetti. And our legendary Spearmaster Eric, commander of our second squad, died that day in the tunnels. But Logim, the armorer, was carrying some bricks, because things had gone silent, and as swiftly as she arrived, Logim blocked the hole. It was time to continue digging. Hell was falling. The dwarves could smell victory, but the final assault was yet to come. But a new problem was emerging. The frame rate was dropping. Now this was confusing to me. I wasn't totally sure why this was happening. And then I realized those eyeless devils kept making triplets. And there was a lot of them. And I apologize for this next bit, because the quality is significantly lower. Apparently I forgot to record this VOD, meaning I'm using the direct download from YouTube, which looks like butts. My apologies for the lower quality in the next little bit and my dumb face that might appear in the corner. Anyways, where was I? Right. What I did was I dug 2 really long tunnels, took the new batch of hydras that I had been breeding over the past few months down and stuck them in the tunnels. Once inside, I released hell once more and let the absolute absurd Congo line of demons run through, which my bolt throwers barely even put a dent in. And then they entered my tunnel. Hopefully Irvad here lives up to her name and runs real quickly, because you gotta make it to that exit. Once the last of them had entered the tunnel, we shut the gates, and they began fighting with the rocks, and soon after, the hydras. The rocks fell so quickly that they almost weren't even worth noting. The hydras, however, held up a bit of a better fight. They did better than the initial fight versus those flaming creatures, but their numbers were too great, and the hydras fell. Once every last hydra had been killed in the tunnel, all of the demons were sealed inside. They had no way out. So I chiseled out the ceiling above and connected it to a support, while the remainder of my dwarves did their best to lower the numbers of creatures that were still trying to emerge. Once the structure was completed, Aitun here was given the order to give the lever a pull to collapse the cavern. And it worked pretty effectively, maybe a bit too effectively, because you see, it went through some layers I wasn't expecting, and released new threats. And on top of that, I missed a chunk of it, which didn't kill all of them. It did kill the majority, though. Nothing my military can't handle. There were more casualties, of course, but the majority of those demons that were remaining were heavily injured, and the dwarves were able to best them. Heroes on this day. You make the king proud. And the stupidity of the Cyclopses never seems to end. Perhaps it's limitless. But with the Congo line of eyeless demons cleared, hell went rather silent. And I built a series of stairs down to the slayed ground. Once it was completed, of course, some creatures came running, those that couldn't fly, and enter the fort themselves, but they fell swiftly. The soldiers that survived the battles had become hardened with age and time. More bolt throwers and ballista were set up as mandatory defense, and walls were erected. Monsters Mash was going to be a legend for eternity. A fortress defended by dragons, with a stronghold in the depths. Memorial halls of artifacts were constructed, and a tavern was built. And while there were still some unfortunate accidents, it was just like things they'd seen before, and the dwarves pushed through. Even the peasants were killing beasts at this point. From the lowest population in the world to a legendary mountain home. It was over 20 years ago that Dragon Trap was founded to capture the first dragon, and against all odds, completed that task. Then Monsters Mash was founded, which sat waiting for their great dragon to arrive. Once it did, the fortress built into a great stronghold, and after a mere decade, they'd raised a brood of young dragons. Flocks of giant rocks, and hordes of hydras. If nothing else, Monsters Mash stands at a testament of the power of the Dwarven army, the resilience of a dead faction, and the ability to make peace with any human, goblin, or elf. The fortress will live on and continue against all odds. The trade economy was great, and the population was beginning to recover. I mean, hell, who wouldn't want to live near the eerie, purple pools of the underworld? Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this fortress and would like to try it out for yourself, I'm going to link to the save file in the description down below. This video was created using just under 100 hours of live streamed footage. If you would like to watch the VODs in their original state, you can do that on my VOD channel at Blind Extras. And if you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, subscribe to this channel, and you can also consider supporting me over on my website. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one. Pum pum. Pum pum.